In spring 2020, COVID swept our community, and the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd reinvigorated racial justice protests across the country. As members of our community coped with multiple traumas, and now we can add in the fires there. But back in spring, Dr. Jeremiah Sims and his co-authors offered a webinar series based in their book, Minding the Obligation Gap in Community Colleges and Beyond. And for me, that offered a space to seek more knowledge, clarity, and support at a time when I really needed it. Their work reminds us that knowing better and doing better in our context at the community college means taking responsibility for structural inequities whose greatest burdens fall on hyper-marginalized students. Our mission statement offers us the impetus to do just that. It says that our college will, quote, ensure student access through comprehensive educational programs and support services responsive to our diverse communities. By the way, like a lot of you, I memorized that during accreditation when we were writing the report. Our challenge now, of course, is how to fulfill the mission statement and, to be frank, to reconstruct ourselves through an equity lens. So today's keynote speaker is here to help us think through this challenge, Dr. Jeremiah Sims. He has given us permission to call him Jeremiah instead of saying Dr. Sims. So Jeremiah Sims, PhD, is the inaugural Director of Equity for the College of San Mateo. Dr. Sims was born in Oakland and raised in Richmond, California. Because of his own life experiences, Jeremiah has devoted his career to the realization of educational equity for hyper-marginalized students. Jeremiah is an alumnus of the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a BA in rhetoric with honors, as well as an MA and PhD in a program titled Language, Literacy, and Culture in UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education. Jeremiah's work, chronicled in his first book, Revolutionary STEM Education, Critical Reality Pedagogy, and Social Justice in STEM for Black Males, 2018, details his experiences as an educator working toward a revolutionary paradigm shift in the STEM education of and for Black boys. His second book, Minding the Obligation Gap in Community Colleges, 2020, illuminates the role that community college practitioners, hey, that's us, must willingly play in order to deconstruct the institutionalized inequities found in higher education. Precisely because those inequities disproportionately penalize poor, ethno-racially minoritized students of color. Jeremiah is currently working on a new book, developing an anti-racist growth mindset, working towards a redesign forthcoming. And Dr. Sims is also the editor of a Peter Lang book series, Educational Equity in Community Colleges, an educator, administrator, speaker, author, and consultant. Jeremiah resides in the East Bay area with his wife, Rachel, and their 5 boys, Judah, Malachi, Zion, Freedom, and Jehu. We have invited Dr. Sims here to help us learn more and do better, as Dr. Maya Angelou put it. Opening access to higher education means acknowledging the gifts and unique ways of knowing that hyper-marginalized students and would-be students bring. Therefore, we must sustain those at Green River College doing the ongoing collaborative grassroots work, including the already mentioned GDEC, our IDC, and the larger group at the state level, the DEI in Washington CTC's group. I think that Dr. Johnson has given us a pretty good introduction to GDEC and the IDC, but I'll mention them really quickly, if that's all right. Just to remind you that the Green River Diversity and Equity Council, locally known as GDEC, is co-chaired by Dr. Vic Bahal and Marwa Al-Musawi, and it's a grassroots group powered by faculty, staff, and students that pursues racial equity forward initiatives. Recently in June, they offered a forum called Dismantling Institutional Racism at GRC with more than 225 attendees. Pretty amazing. The IDC, or the Instructional Diversity Council, led by Doctors Michael Moreno and Marcela Fleitas-Lear, administers the diversity course requirement and is getting more deeply involved in working with the LOC this year on a campus-wide outcome on diversity, and also working to improve the faculty contract where equity is concerned. And we have this other group operating both within and kind of beyond the college, the rapidly developing DEI in Washington CTCs group. Amanda Chin is doing a ton of work. It's organizing faculty and staff across the state to build knowledge and lead initiatives, and we should stay tuned. I just wanted to share this information so that Dr. Sims knows that we welcome him, that we've got grassroots people here doing this work, sharing the knowledge, sharing the resources, and working toward accountability as they collaborate to make change. Thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for coming and collaborating with us today. We appreciate you. We appreciate your presence. I'm going to turn it over. Remember, everybody, chill out in the chat until he asks you to please participate. We will have a Q&A at the end, and then you can go chat wild and ask us your questions. All right, thanks very much. I turn it over to Dr. Sims.
Okay, perfect. Wow. So we're going to open up with this quote right here from Paulo Freire. I wish I was better at rolling R's, but I'm not. And so it says, education doesn't change people. Excuse me, education doesn't change the world. Education changes people. People change the world. And so that's an important quote. So Freire is one of the foremost kind of educational philosophers over the last 100 or so years. His seminal book, he was ultra prolific. His seminal book was Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he kind of juxtaposed the thinking model of education and put that in opposition to a problem-posing education. So banking model of education is, if I speak to this group of learned folks and I say 5 plus 5 is 10, 5 plus 5 is 10, 5 plus 5 is 10, and I ask Danny, I say, hey, Danny, what's 5 plus 5? Danny says 10, right? Purportedly, that's proof of learning, right? But all Danny has done at that point is regurgitated the information that I've already given him, and there's no real entry point for him to have any kind of critical consideration around what he just learned and to see whether or not it fits within his context or if it makes sense to him at a personal level, because we know from Imerodino Yang's work in 2016 that emotional responses actually precede any type of cognitive understanding. So learning is at its core emotional. And so the banking model of education limits any type of real association because it treats the content as king, as opposed to figuring out how students actually learn. We try to foist our sensibilities on them and get them to learn the way that we teach, right? Which is backwards, according to Freire. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do see, feel, respond. And so that's just the agenda for the day. We'll talk about COVID-19, right? We know that we're in the midst of a pandemic, and this is a dual pandemic, right? Because white supremacy and perverse capitalism have been wreaking havoc on people of color and non-people of color for centuries, right? COVID-19 is new, but the other pandemic, right, this kind of structuralized inequity is not new. We'll define some key terms. We'll talk about an anti-racist growth mindset. And then I have a tool that I want to share with you all. And this tool is designed to be an entry point into the work, even if you don't know as much as some other folks do about critical race theory or equity, right? If your heart is in the right place and you want to do this work, I feel like this impact grid that I'll get into in some detail later is a perfect entry point into the conversation, because it doesn't rely on an overabundance of a priori or previous knowledge in order to do the work. So now we're going. So I'm going to talk about one student's journey. So I spent time as a transfer student advisor, and I got to work with a lot of students, primarily Black and brown students. And so I'm going to share, I have permission to share this story with you. And so I'm going to share this particular student's journey. And this particular student wrote a poem. And so I'm going to read parts of the poem. I myself am not a poet. I'm going to read parts of the poem. Hopefully my cadence is okay. And then I'm going to kind of intersperse some facts about the student's life so that you know what's going on. And so the poem is called Where I'm From. And I can say that this student's experience was not anomalous because I worked with Black and brown, low income students, and experience in community college, because remember I was a transfer student advisor, is not the exception. It's actually the rule for the 70 plus students that I work with. All right, part one. And so I'm reading. It's called Where I'm From. I grew up in what is now referred to as the trap. Matter of fact, I grew up in the trap listening to gangster rap while giving OGs, killers, and gangsters dap. I internalized fear, despair. On the outside, it looked as though I didn't have a care. I was too macho. But in reality, I was afraid to dare to face my real feelings. Abandonment. My pops wasn't around. Hopelessness. No aspirations, no goals, just living for the day. Not sure if tomorrow was coming. I knew how ephemeral life was, even if I didn't know that word, because I witnessed young men's lives snuffed out prematurely because of white supremacy in the form of forced hypermasculinity, structured institutional violence, and socio-emotional anonymity. It's a lot of words, I get it. I'm from broken glass everywhere, lots of laughter, lots of fun, but was enshrouded by a cloud of despair. My mother, bless her heart, tried to teach me how to be a man. Some of those lessons were steeped in masculinity. They were bad, but she gave me all that she had. My neighborhood taught me how to ignore pain, because if you're soft, you're lost. No matter what, I would say it's good. That's all I knew. That's what I learned from my neighborhood. I learned how to swallow emotions because that's what men do. All the while, I thought this behavior was cool. So this is a student who grew up without a father. His interactions with his father were limited. His father was not available to him emotionally or physically because his father was a bank robber. His father actually robbed 15 banks, and prior to that, he had spent time in prison for manslaughter. He had spent time in prison for dealing drugs. This student talked about seeing kind of bags of marijuana in his father's house, grocery bags full of marijuana in his father's house. And he told a funny story about one time he was at his father's house, and he found himself in a tree, on a tree limb, and he was hanging out with a squirrel and a puppy. That's not possible. That young man was more than likely high because that's his father was selling a lot of drugs. So anyway, it's not funny, but it's funny in retrospect. Oh yeah, and so remind me if I forget in the chat to tell you what the student is up to today. He's no longer a student, but it's a pretty cool story. So his father robbed multiple banks. Oh, eventually his father, who he thought passed, the student went to go check on his father because he hadn't heard from him some time, and he was told by a neighbor, a long-time neighbor of his father, that his father had passed. And so he thought that's where it was. At 13, he thought his father passed. He didn't shed a tear. They weren't that close. But then later on, his father came back. He resurrected. So it turned out his father had been in prison for robbing banks. And they let him out of jail after only 10 years, where his sentence should have been much steeper. It turned out that his father had full-blown AIDS from intravenous drug use. And so he died not long after that brief reunion. This young man grew up in a neighborhood with the highest murder rate. While he was in high school, it had the highest murder rate per capita in the whole of the United States. He talked about times where he's been robbed at gunpoint. He also grew up with an abusive stepfather. And so his stepfather abused him. His stepfather abused his mother. And there's one time where he recounted vividly and viscerally a time where he saw his stepfather kick a hole in his mother's throat and the tissue come out, right? And this is when he was 6 years old. Because of that, this young man was homeless. His mother had to leave once she healed up, and so they eventually spent time in a battered women's shelter until they could find a place of their own, he and his younger brother. And so I'm going to go on to part two now, see if I can frame this correctly. But you know how it is with technology. I can't lie. This is talking about the macho behavior. It was a defense mechanism, all due to purposeful misrecognition of my personhood. But still, I was good. My people would ask me how I feel, but I assured them I was just going to keep it trill because there was no room to really talk about feelings, which meant there was no room for actual healing. I loved my community. In fact, I love my hood. Nevertheless, I was starting to realize it wasn't all good. Schooling concretized all of my insecurities. Poor young black male, I was considered deficient. As a result, my heart wasn't in it. I was lost. I challenged the system. I was considered disruptive, which prompted discipline. As a result, there was a gap in my achievement. I internalized the lies about black male ability, thinking that ethno-racial identity was an inescapable liability, but that's a lie. I just needed an opportunity to escape this trap so that I could bridge the gap between who I am and who people thought I was because of my cultural identity. So this is a student who grew up in Section 8 housing, low-income housing. And so part of the conditions for living in low-income housing was that you had to take 12 units every semester, but you didn't have to pass, right? And so this particular housing complex didn't allow men in the home. So it was a bunch of single moms or grandmothers or aunts who were taking care of what turned out to be, for whatever reason, a disproportionate amount of young men. And so in middle school, this young man got in trouble, and he went to see his guidance counselor, who would later become principal of the school. And he told him, you know what, it doesn't really matter what you do in middle school. You'll be socially passed, so don't worry about it. So that student at the time took that to mean that he had license to be as disruptive as he could be. And so eventually the student who had very little understanding about how college worked enrolled in community college, and that's where the fun really began, right? And that's where we enter into this conversation. So the student went to community college. He was immediately placed in remedial classes. This student, if I'm remembering correctly, the student missed the cutoff to take an assessment. And so just by the looks of him, right, he was placed in remedial classes. The student shares stories about when he was called out, called names by different community college faculty. Eventually he was dismissed. He was academically dismissed. He had a 1.1 GPA, and that won't cut it. And he said that the only thing that kept him over one was a badminton class and a weightlifting class. I just wanted to share that. And so he was academically dismissed. And so the student was done with school. That was it. He'd already gone through a point where he felt like education wasn't for him. And his community college experience, at least initially, concretized that for him. And so now I'll go on. Part 3, now I know who I am. I'm from the blood of the Lamb, slain for my redemption. Once I realized this, I had a newfound conviction. My relationship with God changed everything. I started to feel, I started to cry, I started to dream. Still running up against opposition that was predicated on and in support of structural racism, oftentimes I felt like I was banging my head on the wall. Then I would remember to call on the author and perfecter of my faith, who would lovingly remind me that I'm his son and I'm saved by grace. There were times when unexpectedly past trauma will erupt. I couldn't identify the triggers. I just knew that enough was enough. I had to watch that old devil, that roaring lion, and remember my true identity as a son of Zion. So I called him my savior. Jesus is his name, and hallelujah, his mercy reached me even when I had one foot in the grave. Again, he reminded me of all the sacrifices he made so that I can be free. So after years out of school, the student returned. He kept hearing stories about the young men that he'd grown up with who weren't doing well. Some were incarcerated, others were kind of downtrodden, and others had their lives snuffed out prematurely. So he returned with some new conviction, was able to go to school, did well. The only reason he went to school is because he said his younger brother mentioned to him there was a thing called academic remediation, which is essentially a second chance. And so he took full advantage of that. He had a 4.0 GPA, took 46 units in one calendar year in order to transfer. And this is where the story gets interesting with community college practitioners. So he spent a lot of time speaking to transfer counselors because he had a specific school he wanted to go to. He wanted to go to a top tier college. And so he spoke to maybe 8 to 10 transfer counselors, and each one was unwilling to humor him with regard to going to that top tier college, because you have to understand this is a student who came from a 1.1, and he'd only shown one semester of promise up until that point, right? And so what was happening is that the deficit model thinking that had impacted him in his first stint in community college, right, this is some 7 years later, was still informing the way that he was viewed by community college practitioners. They didn't view him as someone who was four-year college material, at least not at this top-tier college. And so what was happening is that the folks who worked in that space were determining his future, and he wasn't in a position to determine his own future because he couldn't have conversations. Every time he spoke about that particular college and that major, he was steered in a different direction to other awesome colleges, but just not the one that the student was most interested in attending. And so even after he got into that college, he went to share with a transfer student counselor. And the response was, "Are you sure you want to go there and compete with some of the brightest minds in the nation?" And so the student internalized that. And at that point, this student was in his late 20s and said, "You know what, you're right. I need to just get finished with this," and opted to go to another school instead of that top tier school. And the other school is awesome as well. But it turned out that that the top tier school had a better financial aid package for the student, and so that made the decision somewhat easier. And so the student ended up attending the top tier school anyway. And so I want to talk about this student's journey. And again, remind me to tell you what the student is up to now. I want to talk about this student's journey because there's so many things going on there. We receive students at the community college level, right? We receive students who have gone to under-resourced schools, who have gone to schools who have not seen them as whole people. And if we do the same thing, what we do is we replicate the kind of injustices and injurious behavior that students are enduring in these K-12 spaces. When we do that, all we're doing is concretizing the reality for these students, for poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color, that schooling is not really for you, right? Because if you can't do it at K-12 and you can't do it here, how are you going to do it at the next level? And so that's what was going on with the student. And even again, after the student had some level of success, the system was not yet willing to accept that this student could be someone who could thrive at a top tier college. And so anyway, we'll get back to who the student is. I'm going to move on for now. Oh, there's the student right there. So that's my story. I just wanted to share with you all. These are all my kids, my lovely wife, who you saw helping with the technological issues. We have 5 boys, 5 amazing, beautiful boys. Been blessed. That's my brother-in-law in the second picture with his 2 girls. So on my wife's side, those are all the grandchildren, except just had a new nephew. I didn't have him, but my sister-in-law just had a son. I have a new nephew as of 2 days ago. All right, so we'll move on. All right, so we're going to go through this activity. And after this, there'll be a breakout. In this activity, I'll read through what's here. It's called See, Feel, Respond. So disclaimer, you can opt out. There's 500 plus people in here. I wouldn't know if you opted out anyway, but you can feel free to opt out. There's no judgment there. You're about to see a series of slides that contain images and memes that have been known to cause intense visceral reactions, especially to those who are energy sensitive. If you do not want to participate in this activity, turn away from your screen now, and I'll let you know when it's safe to return. Most of these slides contain 1 to 2 images. These images will appear fairly quickly. So what I'm asking you all to do, this is a time where you can just flood the chat. I'm going to show these images. It's going to be fairly quick. And I want you to type the first 1 to 3 words that come to mind, right? Just the first 1 to 3. You don't have to compose anything. I don't need a dissertation. Just the first 1 to 3 words that come to mind as you see these slides. And we're going to go through this fairly quickly. Again, you maybe have 5 to 7 seconds for each slide. The words that are more wordy, I'll leave open a little bit longer. All right. So if you don't want to do it, that's totally okay. I still love you. If you do, here we go. Again, 1 to 3 words. So hopefully the chat is open, but yeah, put your responses in the chat, please. Sorry, I can't move it now. See the. Don't know what's happening. There's no cursor. Yeah. So you get a lot of time with this one. Yeah, you can skip. More technical issues. I apologize. There we go. How'd you do that? All right, here we go. It's weird. I'm stuck. Where's the cursor? All right. So now we're going to go into a breakout room. And so you should be getting an invitation shortly. And so once you get into the breakout room, what we want is for there to be a scribe, so to speak, that's going to come back, be able to hear from everyone. Obviously, there are too many people, but we want to hear from some groups about what you found to be interesting in the conversation, what were the commonalities, and what surprised you. So just think about one thing that you want to share from your group, what was interesting, what was common amongst the people in your group, and what surprised you most. And so we'll come back in about 10 minutes to have that conversation. Welcome back. And so for the groups, we just want to hear from a handful of groups. For people that are ready to share, please raise your hand, and then the moderators will select you based on your hand raising. Because I'd love to hear from folks.
Hi, everybody. I posted some summary comments that my group talked about in the chat as well. Some of the things that people found kind of interesting during the activity and commonalities that we talked about during just all of the events over the past months and years is that people felt like it's really hard to process the images and choose adequate words, that some people feel kind of numb, or some people feel tearful and just really upset and angry by all of the images, and words like horrific or injustice or pain just don't even really characterize what's happening in the pictures and in the world. One thing that we talked about that was kind of surprising is just how many people we see on social media, within families, close friends, clashing on both sides of these arguments. And how when there's news of a new event, sometimes it feels like we have to avoid certain family members because we don't want to hear their viewpoint, because it's just too much, having to unfriend, unfollow, hide people that don't feel like they can discuss things civilly, or feel like it's so important to take sides and really strong stances, which just adds to the anger and exhaustion that many people are feeling. Thank you.
I saw Rolita's hand.
Yep, thanks, Kirsten. Hi, everyone, welcome. Thank you again, Dr. Jeremiah Sims, for being with us today. We had a really great conversation. A variety of things came up, from personal to kind of from the periphery of observing what was going on. It looks like with all of the images, there were some recurring themes with Black Lives Matter, say her name, which are common phrases, to folks who are growing Black and brown children, and thinking about what that would be like to have conversations, especially for kids. For one of our group members having a child who's turning 2 years old, and then thinking about things that parents shouldn't be talking about, but now this person is thinking about, like, what am I having to think about and talk about to my 2-year-old as he or she is growing up? What does this mean for the future? Very mixed feelings, such a tough emotion. I myself have a 17-year-old Black brown son, and we talk about this all the time. After George Floyd's murder, it was havoc in our household, lots of tears, lots of anger. Other folks in our group talked about growing up and being in a predominantly white community, and learning from history lessons that these things were in the past, but really not really, so gut-wrenching to know that we are still in 2020 talking about these things. And we also talked briefly about what can we do as we move forward. How do we do better? What are some concrete things that we could do? How do we bring more diverse voices to be aware of our students and to love our students, and to support them? And how do we create a more validating and responsive community? Thank you.
Thank you, Rolita. I see Chitra's hand. Chitra?
Yeah, hi. I was just typing it out on chat, but I'll just give a quick summary here. Many people in our group spoke about the impact of seeing these images right one after the other. And for folks out there who are thinking, is this for real? Is this really that bad? this seemed like a perfect rebuttal to that feeling, because it is that bad. And I think COVID and our remote modality has made it very difficult for us to judge what students are going through, because we don't always see their eyes, their body language. Many students don't want to show themselves on video, especially if they're going through a tough time. So this really gives us pause to understand and really dwell on, what our students may be going through and may be impacted by this rather heavily. Many of them are, and to make sure we treat them with the dignity and fairness that they deserve. We need to give them the benefit of the doubt and keep going back to the drawing board to see if we can do better.
Thank you, Chitra. Did you have more?
No, that was sort of a short summary of what we talked about.
Thank you. I believe that we are out of raised hands unless somebody just put theirs up a second ago. So Dr. Sims?
All right. So thank you. And I understand again that the activity itself, and I was able to participate somewhat surreptitiously in one of the groups. And so I heard people talking about how jarring the experience is, because the images already are emotive enough and cause a visceral reaction for folks. But they're going by so quickly, right? And so obviously we can't replicate, nor would I want to replicate the angst that people of color feel in the society, where it seems that all the weapons of the state are formed against you. Lived in that space, who don't live in that space, to understand the kind of angst, right? Psychosocial, even, ultimately become psychosomatic, these kind of stressors that you have to live through being a person of color in a society where your life is not held at the same level, is not valued in the same way that more kind of hegemonic Eurocentric, i.e. white folks, are in a system that's predicated on white supremacy and racialized capitalism. And so I showed those images for this reason. If those images, for whatever reason, if you can look at them and feel nothing, there's a problem there, right? You are not yet at a place where you can be empathic. You need to be empathic. You need to be able to demonstrate some empathy. And actually you have to fall in love with justice. So if you love justice, then you should, most of the images, not all, some were positive, but most of those images should be repugnant to you if you love justice, right? And so the idea is that you don't even have to love every individual student. If you love justice, you'll treat them, you'll be oriented to them in a way that will create opportunities for them to reach their fullest, not only academic, but also human potential. So again, these images didn't move you at all, then you're not yet ready to do this work, but that's okay. Because you have to recognize, because it's not about convincing people. This is an issue. When you do work, when you do justice work, when you do agency, inciting, equity, advancing justice work, it has to come from the heart. You have to be enamored by and wholly in love with justice. That's the reality. And so if you aren't yet, this is your wake-up call. I'm not going to call you out. We're going to call you in. Those images should bother you. If they don't, then you need to figure out why that's the case. You cannot contribute meaningfully to anti-racist work or decolonizing work if you can look at those images and feel nothing. And so I just want to share that. It's not a call out, it's a call in. Speak to someone that you trust. Reach out, whoever it is on your campus, right? I'm not the sole kind of holder of knowledge with regard to this, right? There's literature, there are YouTube videos, but the reality is that you need to figure out why, if you weren't moved by this, that you weren't, because that is necessary in order to begin to do this work in earnest. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. Nope. No way. Sorry. Here we go. So you don't have to do this. I saw some people were already doing this. Totally up to you. And obviously, this is if you're able to. We understand that, we are in a community that's filled with differently able people, right? So if you're able to, let's just take a second to breathe. You may have already done this in your group. Stand up, or sit up straight in your chair with both feet on the ground. Close your eyes and take deep breaths to settle in. Inhale deeply and exhale slowly. And so I just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to come back, and I'll just be quiet for 30 seconds or so, and so we can breathe. All right, so now we're going to talk about COVID-19 and the racial contract. COVID-19 exacerbates pre-existing macrostructural racialized inequity. So what do all those words mean, right? So the difference between micro and macro, right? Macro is large scale. And so the issue a lot of times when people talk about racism is kind of this individualized idea of racism, or the type of racism that was kind of exemplified or instantiated by like Ku Klux Klan, for example, right? That's not the type of racism, individualized racism that we're talking about, because those instances of individualized racism aren't as problematic if they're not supported by a superstructure or a macro structure that questions whether or not Black and brown lives matter at the same level as white lives, right? And so the reason that those individual acts of racist terror are so problematic is because more often than not, they happen with impunity, because we live in a country that supports the idea that these people can be treated poorly because of the families that they are born into. And so we know from COVID that Black and brown folks are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, by death, by loss of family members, by loss of income, right? Because more often than not, Black and brown folks, because of racialized capital, are essential workers, right? And so they are in a position where they are exposed at a different level than other folks with regard to COVID-19. African American and other communities of color have been especially impacted. In Milwaukee, for example, 75% of all COVID-related deaths were African American. Here's another. I like to take a look at social media to see what folks are talking about. That's why I've included tweets and memes and those types of things. Brian Kemp and the GOP. This is genocide, and they know it. Time for more of us to say it out loud. So speaking about what was going on in Georgia. Next. And so here's the thing. Poverty is morbidity. And I want to talk about COVID a little bit, right? So a lot of times you hear the terminology, we may have used it, I may have used it, right? Where it talks about the new normal. Now this distance education is the new normal. And what's implicit in talking about the new normal is a kind of pining for what we consider to be the old normal. And the issue is that for poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color, the new normal, or excuse me, the old normal was bad also, right? If we could snap our fingers and go to 6 months ago prior to COVID, right? For our poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color, they were still facing structuralized racism. They were still facing equity gaps, opportunity gaps. We were still in the midst of an obligation gap that was pathologizing and penalizing them just by virtue of the families that they were born into. All these things were happening. So we have to make sure that as we have these conversations, we frame it correctly. The new normal, this is just where we are, but understanding that where we were prior to this still wasn't beneficial for our poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. And so the disparities in health outcomes for Black peoples and other disproportionately impacted populations are enough to throw even the most promising semester into turmoil. So when our students are returning to us now, they're coming back with new trauma, right? Because we know that Black and brown students have disproportionately been impacted by COVID-19. They may have lost a loved one, they may have lost a job, right? The person who cares for them may have lost a job. There are different things that we need to account for. So it's not just about creating an online atmosphere that replicates schooling, because schooling was already problematic for these students. So as we consider how to transition into this kind of new educational milieu, we have to understand that these students are coming with things that are layered on top of other things. And I made a note to myself earlier because it talked about hypermarginalization. And so what hypermarginalization is, this is based on Loc Wacquant's work from UC Berkeley. is that you could be marginalized for being a woman. You could be marginalized for being poor. You could be marginalized for being a Latino, right? You could be marginalized for being this person. You could be marginalized because you go to an under-resourced school. But when all of those things congeal, that's hyper-marginalization, when they're all stacked on top of each other. So if you're a poor Latino whose parents don't have citizenship status, but all these things congeal together, then that's hyper-marginalization, and that's different than just being marginalized, for example, for being a woman, right? Obviously, that's an issue as well. And another thing I wanted to speak to, I'll get back to that. So based on the survey, sorry, it's okay, it's all right. So we'll talk about the racial contract. Folks have heard of the social contract. The social contract essentially is based on the golden rule, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. The racial contract, Charles Mills' work, is somewhat different. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. However, the racial contract limits this to white men with property. The law says that murder is illegal. The racial contract says that this is conditional. For example, it's fine for people to chase and murder black people if they have decided that black people scare them. Mills wrote that non-white subpersonhood is enshrined simultaneously with white personhood, right? So in this country, we oftentimes, because of our kind of scientific nature, we work to understand things through abstract. White is because it's not black. We understand what black is because it's not white. We've created these false dichotomies that actually control much of our material existence in this country. The racial contract is not partisan. It guides staunch conservatives and sensitive liberals alike, but it works most effectively when it remains imperceptible to its beneficiaries, right? So people that don't know that they are beneficiaries of white privilege or heteropatriarchy, right? Or any number of kind of privileged positions, as long as they don't know that, as they remain unaware of that, then they won't do the work necessary to begin to break those things down. And so often, so what I'm talking about is anti-blackness. I'm reading a book I recommend for all of y'all. It's called Slavery's Capitalism. It's a really interesting book. And so it talks about how slavery, so I use the term racialized capitalism, but according to this book, that's actually redundant. Capitalism in this country, the idea of capitalism as it is currently conceived, actually stems from the plantation, right? So there was a point in early on, right, in slavery where 1/5 of all the wealth in this country was contained within the sinews, the musculature, and the very skin of black people, right? So money initially wasn't accrued, right? Because all the original millionaires accrued their wealth from the slave trade. Money wasn't initially accrued just through cotton production, actually by a credit system that was created to mortgage and then remortgage slaves. And so the original factory model, according to this book, was built on it was intended to replicate the womb of black women, right? Because black women produced a particular kind of commodity, which was black bodies, according to this book. And then I just want to share one more thing. And again, I highly recommend that book. The book talks about the greatest innovation at that time, the most efficient innovation that increased work production and creates efficiency over 400%. Y'all know what that was? It was the whip. It was torture. So we're going. So anti-blackness is the progeny of white supremacy and racialized capitalism. Anti-blackness is simultaneously a macro-structural and commonsensical disregard for the concerns, cares, joys, freedom, bodies, and very lives of black people. So we talked about this earlier. I'll go past this one. So according to the racial contract, here are some examples of the way that things are positioned. Right, you see under Tamir Rice, he was a 12-year-old in Ohio who was killed because he was playing with a toy gun. Another picture, these are men from Michigan who are protesting stay-at-home orders at the state capitol. And this has all been positioned this way. I don't know if folks remember back we had Hurricane Katrina. Associated Press reported on two people. They were in the same body of water, but they made it look like it was two separate pictures. And so they had a couple, a European American couple, and it said they were taking food from a store, and it said these people are looking to survive, and it had an African American man doing the exact same thing. And it said he's looting, right? Those are the way that these things are positioned. And this is what Eddie Glaude Jr. talks about in his book, A Value, right? The value, the differentiated value between the lives of white mainstream folks vis-a-vis Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. All right, so I want you all, here's another chat activity. And so here's what we're gonna do. In the chat, you're just gonna rank. It's like a chicken and egg argument. So I should have put letters next to this to correspond. And so we're just gonna go from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4. White supremacy is 1, racialized capitalism is 2, racism is 3, and race is 4. I want you to put in the chat, if you feel to, the order in which these things originated, which came first. So just put your order. You can just use the numbers. White supremacy is 1, racialized capitalism is 2, racism is 3, and race is 4. Yeah, so a lot of people are putting 4, because I can see the chat down here. 4 and 1. I see a couple folks. Matthew Cullen put racialized capitalism first. Some other folks, I see that Raquel did as well. And so I'm highlighting this because racialized capitalism actually precedes white supremacy. Racialized capitalism, right? The idea that folks wanted to accrue money, accrue capital, accrue surplus value. Surplus value is inherently exploitative. It's built literally on the backs of people of color in this country. That's what racialized capitalism looks like. So racialized capitalism necessitated white supremacy, right? And I'll tell you why. Because the people who came here, who settled in the United States, right, who settled in a place that was already occupied, who stole indigenous lands, who massacred and visited genocidal violence on indigenous people, originally they came here purportedly for a type of religious freedom. So these people considered themselves to be Christians. Christianity in the New Testament, right? You cannot enslave another person as though they are cattle. There were relationships, but that was more along the lines of indentured servitude. You could not own another person. In New Testament times, people could buy themselves out and even marry themselves out of slavery. In the United States of America, African slaves were considered to be property, only 3/5 human, and they were owned in perpetuity. They had no claims to freedom because they were not considered to be human beings. And so white supremacy was built in order to justify the mistreatment that racialized capitalism visited on initially indigenous folks and then African slaves. And so because of racialized capitalism, because they needed a justification to enslave human beings, they had to consider them non-human. To do that, there had to be a way to differentiate between humanity and non-humanity or subhumanity. And this talks about racialized capitalism here. This is a quote from Minding the Obligation Gap. Which I can't read. I'm not gonna be able to do it. Right, and so this speaks to what I talked about earlier, but I'll just let folks take a look at the graphic there. You see the red dot all the way at the bottom. 40% would own this red dot. So now we talk about the obligation gap. So what does all this have to do with the obligation gap? The obligation gap is the gap between the services that we provide as institutions of higher learning and what students actually need to reach their fullest academic potential. And so oftentimes, and we know this to be the case if we're being honest with each other, right? We're comrades, we're colleagues. We often foist our sensibilities on our feel like students need X. And so we figure out programs and try to design them in a way to deliver X to students. But students may need something different altogether. And until we talk to them, until we interface with them, we're not going to be able to actually speak to the needs that they have. Because here's the thing. Every single policy, practice, procedure, pedagogy that we institutionalize and use and deploy positively impacts some of students and negatively impacts other students. There's no middle ground. There's no fence for folks to sit on. And so the main point of this conversation is just that there's no liminal space. There's no middle ground. You have to get off the fence. because we've seen a fence, right? 45 is trying to develop a fence. He's trying to build a fence, apparently in Colorado, but he's trying to build a fence. We don't want to be in support of that fence. If you're on the fence about these matters, then you are necessarily supporting the weight and the fidelity of the fence. It's much harder to move if you yourself are on the fence. You have to get off the fence. In order to get off the fence, you have to understand that you have an obligation to create equitable opportunities for your students to reach their fullest potential, for all the students that you serve. So operationalize educational equity. Educational equity must be achieved via intentional work towards the creation of positive educational spaces that actively combat structural and institutionalized inequity. Of course, these individual microaggressions are important and they need to be addressed. But microaggressions are just that. They're microaggressive and they're problematic because they're supported by a system that has macroaggressed people of color for centuries. So now I want to talk about my next project, which is an anti-racist growth mindset. And so folks are familiar with growth mindset. It was all the rage for a while, right? We understand that growth mindset pits a fixed mindset in diametric opposition to a growth mindset. So a fixed mindset is just, it's you cannot learn. People are predisposed. Either people are math people, they're science people, they're English people. And so I can't think of a better exemplar of a fixed mindset than a mindset that is predicated on racist ideas and white supremacy. That is fixed because it essentializes people. And so we want to be able to move away from that towards anti-racist work. President Johnson was talking, decolonize. How do you move towards anti-racist work? And I think that this is a way that you can do it. So it talks here about what a fixed mindset is. Skills are something that you're born with and they're fixed. People with fixed mindsets tend to give up easily, right? So they would say, well, I can't talk to Chitra, I hope I'm getting that right, about inequities. She can do it. She's better at it. I'm never going to figure it out. I'm never going to be able to speak to it at the level that she can. So then people then preclude themselves from contributing to substantive equity work because they feel like they don't have a way into the conversation. Views effort as unnecessary, takes feedback personally. So if I say to Roseanne, for example, Roseanne, hey, what you said was problematic because you didn't account for the kind of context that the student is coming from. If Roseanne then is defensive, then it's difficult for her to grow, right? People who have a fixed mindset are easily discouraged and blame others for their setbacks. A growth mindset is different, right? Growth mindset understands that skills come from hard work, embraces challenges, right? Listen, racism and inequity are part and parcel of the tapestry of this country. Really, really smart people have been trying out how to mitigate and even eradicate these things. We're still not in the same place. We've made some progress, but we're still struggling with these things. So we need smart people to begin to attack this work from different vantage points. We need paradigm shifts. In order to do that, you're going to have to understand that you don't have to know it all. You don't have to be able to speak to these things at the level that I can, for example, in order to do this work. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. You have to learn from the feedback that you receive, and you have to use setbacks. So you made a mistake. You said something that was potentially problematic. Well, then you apologize and you speak to people who you trust to help you work through those things. This is another book that I recommend, Jo Boaler's book. She's a professor at Stanford University. It's called Limitless Mind. And she has learning keys for each chapter. And I'm just going to talk about the learning keys from chapters 1, 2, and 3. Every time we learn, our brains strengthen or connect neural pathways. We need to replace the idea that learning ability is fixed with the recognition that we're all on a growth journey. And again, I'm telling you that can be an anti-racist growth journey. She gave an example, I believe from with regard to some London taxi cab drivers. It's a really hard job. There's a test that London taxi cab drivers take. They have to memorize 128,000 streets in London. The test, normally they study for 4 years. She was looking at middle-aged men. These men were 45 to 60 who were taking this test. On average, it takes 12 attempts to complete this test. Once you complete this test, then you can drive for London's Black Cab Company, which is the most prestigious company in London. And so what they found to be the case is that while these men were studying for this test, their hippocampuses actually grew because they were making new neural pathways and new synaptic connections. so that they can memorize that. So the brain is malleable. Knowledge is not fixed, right? So if you don't understand what anti-racism is, if you don't understand what equity work looks like in practice, you can do it. You have to have the heart to do it. That I can't give you. But once you have the heart to do something about this work, because you're beginning to love justice or you already love justice, then there are ways that you can move forward in this work. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the impact grid. We'll go past this one. Oh, well, this is important. It can be completely changed and rewired. That's important information. Those who believe in fixed brains and giftedness also believe that boys, men, racial groups are gifted, and girls, women, and other racial groups are not. Right? We have to move away from that. It's a fixed mindset, and it's incredibly problematic. So here are some of the characteristics of the anti-racist growth mindset. I'm just going to read a few because there's a lot here. Believes that cultural competency and anti-racist mindset are important. Actually, you have to believe that they're integral. If you want to do actual justice work that is equity advancing, then you have to understand that you can't do this work. You can't do the work and then try to sprinkle on some justice, sprinkle on some equity later. You have to position yourself to deliver equity and justice through the work that you do, right? And that's a paradigm shift. If you're a math professor, you teach equity through math. Right? If you're an English professor, you teach equity through math, not the other way around. Because if content is always king, if the way that we teach doesn't account for the type of students, or if the way that we work through our administrative roles or whatever our roles are on campus, the way that we interface and interact with students, if they don't meet students where they are, then they will continue to struggle. Believes that an anti-racist mindset is by default besought by racist ideas. So if you don't have this yet, you do have racist ideas. You do. It's true. I have them. I have to work through them. We all have them, right? It's interesting because I'm a Christian. I think that's probably become clear to folks by now. And this is really prominent, right? We understand that Christians have any level of sin and we need to go to God with regard to our sin. But for a lot of my, American brothers and sisters, they don't believe that they can be racist. If you don't believe that you have a problem, then the problem will never be addressed. And so I want to be clear, if you're not already functioning from an anti-racist growth mindset or anti-racist educational paradigm, likely, even if it's unintentional, you are contributing to a racist superstructure that is disproportionately impacting poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color. We have to be able to embrace the discomfort that accompanies conversations around white supremacy, racialized capitalism, and anti-Black and other forms of racism. If we're going to grow, we have to, it's just like anything else. When we're learning, right, we have to be uncomfortable. If we're not, then we'll shut down the learning. We won't be able to develop those neural pathways that Jo Boaler was talking about in her work, Limitless Mind. We have to believe deeper understanding of the concept and application of an anti-racist growth mindset can be developed through practice. It can. I've seen it on my campus. I've seen transformations in people because they were willing to be uncomfortable. They were comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, and their growth has been exponential. So just a quick recap. An anti-racist growth mindset desires to identify race-based inequity, to challenge, disrupt anti-Black and other forms of racism in institutionalized practices. In order to do this work, we must embrace the discomfort that comes along with it, and so that we can make these new neural pathways, new connections that are necessary. And again, some of this stuff is focused on the classroom. When I talk about pedagogy, I'm not talking about I'm not limited to classroom pedagogy, right? A pedagogue is a teacher. If you work in financial aid, right? If you work and you keep the grounds clean and you have conversations and you interface with students and you're directing them in some way, you're helping them to understand better how this system works, then you have a particular type of pedagogy because you are a pedagogue. So when I talk about pedagogy, right, how you teach, I'm saying pedagogy campus-wide. And so with this, I'm going to break for 5 minutes and pause for questions. And so I'll let the moderators do their magic because I don't want to have any more technological issues if I can help it.
Hey folks, if you could please put your questions into the chat, and then they will be funneled to me by somebody, and then I will ask them to Dr. Sims in just a moment here. So please put your questions into the chat. I think we've got some folks moving those over so that I can then ask them to Dr. Sims in just a moment here. So I see one question already about the title and author of the book that was referenced. I'm going to let everybody type their questions in. Those are going to get sent to me, and then I will ask them. So I'm going to mute myself now. I don't know if anybody wants to type some questions into the chat.
If not, we can keep it moving. We'll have another opportunity, but it's up to y'all. I just want to pause because there was a lot of information.
Dr. Sims, if you have had a second to catch your breath, is this a good time for me to start sending you the questions? Or
Sure, I'm ready.
Great. So I'm going to be just kind of going through the list that is being sent to me in another stream here.
Okay.
So the first question was, could you please share the title and author of the book that was referenced? I know you referenced several. And then somebody in a few questions asks a question like, you know, could we have your reading list? So I don't know if you want to handle those at the same time.
Sure. So I can circle back with the folks who I've been in communication with. The book is called Slavery is Capitalism. And it's by, I can't see it right here. Hold on just a second. Nope, it's playing. Because there are a bunch of slavery is capitalism. So I'll circle back with that. Oh, here it is right here. Oh, so Mark, I think Mark, someone put it in the chat already. So it's in the chat. But I'll share.
Great. The next question, somebody asks, can this PowerPoint be available to us?
Sure, you can have it.
Okay. I'm sure people with more power than me will make sure that that happens. Here's a great question. What suggestions do you have for instructors who say content is king and I don't have the time to infuse equity?
So what I would say, so I started out as a adjunct. So I went to school to be a professor of education, and I taught middle school, high school, and so I've spent some time in the classroom, and so as well as undergraduate and graduate level courses. And so here's the thing: if that is your position, then what will happen is what has always been happening, right? So if you're not positively impacting poor ethno-racially minoritized students of color, if they're not doing as well in your class, then they're going to continue to not do well in your class. So the reason why philosophically, right, if you want to do better by students who are disproportionately impacted societally and also educationally, because we replicate many of those injustices on our campuses, then you have to. I mean, I could come up with some words and manufacture some sentences, but the reality is, if you want to see different results for your disproportionately impacted students, then you have to work from a frame where what you're after is equity. Because content, so if you look at Christopher Emdin's work, for example, Christopher Emdin had a best-selling book in 2017. It's called For White Folks That Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. So Christopher Emdin is a science educator. And so he has what he calls the 5 C's of reality pedagogy. And so my other book is called Critical Reality Pedagogy. So critical reality pedagogy is, if you think about the for critical thinking, right? To think outside the box is critical thinking. Critical reality pedagogy is to think outside the box and then create opportunities for students to turn around, look at the box's positionality to figure whether or not it needs to be deconstructed so that it can become commensurate with social justice, right? So it's not enough to get people outside the box. You have to look at the box's positionality, see who's being negatively impacted, see who's being privileged, and figure out how to remanufacture or deconstruct the box altogether so that it's no longer existent. So Christopher Emdin in his work, reality pedagogy, so critical reality pedagogy is kind of marrying critical pedagogy and reality pedagogy, talks about the 5 C's of reality pedagogy. And he does a bunch of talks, amazing educator, but he has a 16-minute video on YouTube that you all should check out. Just search, it's a TEDx talk, Christopher Emdin, reality pedagogy. And he talks about the 5 C's of reality pedagogy, which are co-generative dialogues, right? Conversations between students and the person who's facilitating the learning so that they can build knowledge together. Co-teaching, where he employs on a rotating basis students who are who help him understand. I did this as well, right? When I work with middle schoolers, they say, hey, Mr. J, you're yelling a little bit too much. We understand that we weren't listening, but when you yell, we don't want to listen to you anymore, right? So it's co-generative dialogues, co-teaching, cosmopolitanism. So he talked about bringing aspects of students' real life experiences into the classroom space. So instead of saying, go to the corner, because he's teaching in New York, go to the corner and grab that beak, renamed it. He said, go to 25th and Linux and bring that book over here, right? And then he had context. Context is essential, right? Because when you don't consider context, all the work that you're doing is decontextualized, right? So you like the material, that's why you teach it. Students don't have to like it the same way that you do. It needs to make sense to them. It needs to make sense to their lives, and that's where critical contextualization comes in. And the last thing he put intentionally was content. Content was number 5, right? So you want to deliver these other things via the content. The content is the vehicle to deliver equity and justice. Until you figure out how to make that paradigm shift in your pedagogy or the way that you interface with students, then you're going to continue to get the same results. Poor ethno-racially and minoritized students of color will continue to suffer if you don't make those changes. And that's the reality. So the question then is, do you want to do something different? Because if you do, you need that type of change.
Thank you so much. May I move on to the next question? The next question, which I think dovetails with some of what you've already said here, is what are some of the best first steps for establishing an anti-racist growth mindset?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. But so we're going to talk about a tool after very shortly, and that tool is a way to kind of welcome you into this conversation. So we're going to talk about the impact evaluation grid, right? And so this, I promise you, this is not going to devolve into a infomercial. But the impact evaluation grid, impact is an acronym. It stands for innovative, mindful, purposeful, anti-racist, caring, and transformative. For some reason I thought I had another finger, but so anyway, that's the impact grid. And so what it does is it creates opportunities for you to look at your pedagogy, to look at the policies, practices, procedures, irrespective of whether or not you have a wealth of knowledge with regard, even if you don't read Slavery is Capitalism or Begin Again or Minding the Obligation Gap, you can still commit to this work by working through this toolkit. And so we're going to transition to the toolkit. Let me see. I'm going to go to the next slide. So to get to that question, I think a good step is coming up next, if that's okay. And if there's more follow-up necessary, then I can do that after this portion.
Great. There are a lot of great questions already. We'll just hold them there. It sounds like you're ready to move on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'll do my very best to attend to the questions. If people need me to stick around for lunch, and if you just want to reach out to me, we can do that as well. I know y'all need to eat, and I just want to say that I hope everybody is doing well in spite of all the fires and just in spite of 2020. It's something. All right. So now what? Action is the antithesis of ambivalence. Right. So what I'm writing about in this book, anti-racist growth mindset, how an anti-racist growth mindset can help you redesign your college redesign, because the reality is that college redesign is in need of redesign. Colleges were created in a way that's incredibly problematic. They're created in a way that privilege white land owning males. That hasn't changed that much. And so we keep hitting our heads on the wall or scratching our heads or some other kind of head idiom. But the reality is we're trying to work within a system that is already problematic because it's inequitable and it's predicated on obligation, an obligation gap and different types of opportunity gaps that when congealed, they form the obligation gap. So what we have to do is reimagine the way that we redesign our redesign so that we're taking into account, the quotidian things that we do, the everyday commonplace things that we do that are incredibly problematic. And some issues, we'll talk about some examples as we move on. So remember, action is the antithesis of ambivalence. So here's how I'm envisioning these things working out, right? So you have anti-racism, right? This is an intentional work to identify, call out, mitigate, and ultimately deconstruct anti-Black and other forms of racism that are in our policies, practices, and pedagogies, right? That is enough to be non-racist, right? That's what Kendi talks about. right? You have to be actively anti-racist, which means that you're fighting against, right? You're fighting against racism. And there's a growth mindset, right? Which based on that word from Dweck and Bowler, we understand that our minds can grow. We can learn things that are not only previously unknown to us, right? But we can learn things that we feel like we don't have enough knowledge in. So we can learn how to be anti-racist. We can have, and so the way that I connect these two things, the way that it makes sense to me is this impact toolkit, right? So the impact equity toolkit for me is the bridge between anti-racism and growth mindset. Because no matter how many conversations I have with you, even Frank Harris, who's coming up later, who's an amazing educator, much of my work is built on his shoulders. Frank Harris, Luke Woods, those are my guys, right? No matter how eloquent a speaker is or how knowledgeable they are, the reality is that in order to do this work, right, you have to understand that it's going to take effort on your part. It's going to take a growth mindset. You have to believe that you can do this, but it's not about convincing you of that. Solidarity comes from doing the work. Once you begin to do the work, that's when your anti-racist growth mindset will grow. So you don't have to develop the mindset first before you begin. You begin. Use a toolkit, right? Toolkit's not perfect. You'll have to tweak it for your particular context. But when you start with this work, it will give you a shared commitment. It will give you a shared language. And it will provide opportunities for entry points into this conversation for people, irrespective of where they are right now at this moment. And so that's the glue between these two things. And so I know that you all can't read that particularly well, but I'll talk through it. So innovative, right? Something is, so this is the quick kind of evaluation tool, right? There's another document that's a deeper dive. And so the first symbol is a heart with a fist intertwined that represents solidarity. The second symbol is just a heart, right? Which means it's well-intentioned. And the third is the institution, right? It's a picture of a building, right? So a lot of things that we do just support the institution. There are things that we all do, if we're honest, we all do every day, and we don't even know why we do those things and where they came from, right? There's just certain parts of the work that we do, how we file papers, how we answer the phone, all these different seemingly quotidian, mundane things can impact certain people, right? And so I'm not trying to make people hyper sensitive, right? Or cause any type of neuroses. But in reality, everything that we do with interfacing with other people, not just students, right? So I want to be clear, a lot of this is student-centered, and it should be, but you all have to be whole people. You have to be in a place where you can contribute and pour out completely. So I want to make sure that I touch on this point. Folks need to be taking care of yourselves mentally, physically, spiritually, right? You need to have an institution that does that, because if you have an institution that is asking you or even requiring you to be completely poured out for your students, but they're not filling your cup, then there's a problem there, right? There's conversations that need to come out of this. And this tool even allows for those types of conversations. And so something is innovative. We know what innovative means, but this is a very particular usage of the word innovative. It's innovative if and only if it addresses structuralized inequity. If it maintains the status quo, then according to this particular grid, it's not innovative. Is it mindful? Does it pay attention to who's being privileged and who's being penalized? Because again, my firm belief is that everything we do positively impacts some and negatively impacts others, right? And so, for example, we talked about at my college, and I don't know if you all do this here, but a lot of colleges in California do this. For the first 2 weeks of a given semester, students can't make an appointment to see a counselor. There's only drop-in hours, right? And so what that does, right? So when we were brick and mortar, it looked different than what it did now, right? But it's not altogether different. So what it did during that time is it precluded certain students who worked, from being able to see a counselor within those first 2 weeks. So they were always starting 2 weeks behind, right? Because there was nowhere in my campus. I don't know if anybody from the Bay Area has visited the College of San Mateo. The College of San Mateo is on top of a hill surrounded by like these $12 million homes. They have like tennis courts and swimming pools, nuts. It's on top of a hill. There's nowhere in the city of San Mateo that you can get to our campus, find a parking space, go see a counselor, and get back to work within the 30-minute lunch break that many of these students have, right? So while ostensibly this seemed like a good policy because it casts a wide net, the students who are being disproportionately impacted by this policy, they all look the same, right? Because these are students who have to work while they're in college, and overwhelmingly these students were black and brown. So doing this type of work, is what allowed us to kind of question the way that we do something that we've done for a long time. Another thing that came up with another college that I'm working with is credit for prior learning versus credit by examination, right? So credit for prior learning, we plugged it into this grid. Credit for prior learning is innovative because it moves the way that we value education. We don't just value canonical kind of white Eurocentric education at the expense of other types of perhaps indigenous or cultural education, right? So when you move towards credit for prior learning, it moves away from a value system that penalizes non-white peoples. It's mindful because it takes into consideration all of the different students that we serve. It's purposeful because it is trying to put students in a position to where they could reach their academic potential. It's anti-racist because, again, it's moving away from a kind of white Eurocentric standard and allowing for different levels and different kinds of knowing to be valued in an educational space. It's caring because it's considering the life experiences of the students we serve, the varied life experience of the students we serve. And it's transformative because it changes the way, if it passes, it will change the way that we do our work, and it will change the way that students can position themselves vis-a-vis the institutions that they're served within. Because the main thing for students, right, this is, Frank Harris may talk about this later. He and Luke Wood talked about this. The primary determinant for Black males, for example, as to whether or not they're going to do well in community college is if they feel welcomed in that space, right? So if you value prior learning, that means that you can no longer require Black and brown students to check their culture at the door of the classroom or check their culture at the door of the institution. But you have to then begin to value who they are and what their level of expertise are, even if it looks different than the canonical information that we cling to so tightly. And so that's what this work was allowing us to do. That was an example of that. Anybody, I want to be clear, anybody can contribute to this work. Right? Anybody. You don't have to be a critical race scholar, right? My training is in critical race theory. It doesn't matter. You just meet with a group of people. So the recommendation, and we'll get into the recommendations later. With this grid, what you do, so there's two steps. There's actually 3 steps. The first 2 steps, you identify the policies that you want to cover, right? So this quick impact evaluation grid helps you identify 3 to 5, and I think 5 is too many. That's what I'm finding to be the case. Let's say 3 policies that you want to take a look at in your respective department or division. You don't do this as an individual, you do this as an inquiry group, right? So you get together with a group of like-minded folks and you identify the policies that you want to take a look at. So you may think that a policy particularly problematic, but after you go through this with your inquiry group, 5 to 7 people, you may find out the policy actually is better situated. And even if it is problematic, it may not be as problematic as other policies. So what this is allowing you to do is to prioritize the policies that you want to evaluate, right? So in the state of California, our state chancellor's office said that we need to audit all of our policies, practices, procedures, pedagogies to make sure that they're commensurate with an anti-racist educational paradigm. Now, I created this before that time, but now the tool is being adopted by a number of schools there because people need a way forward. And so this is that way forward. For many of us, this is what we're doing in my 3 college district. We're taking a look and trying to prioritize. So the way that I envision this working out, and again, if you all want to use the tool, do whatever with it that makes sense for Green River, for the Gator fam. But my recommendation is that you form inquiry groups, departmental, division-wide, cross-representational as much as possible, inquiry groups so that you can have conversations about the policies that you feel beg immediate address, right? Then with each of those 3 policies, there's another sheet, it's called a deep dive, where you really dig into what's going on with those policies to try to figure out if they can be remediated, if so, how, and who needs to be part of that conversation. And I envision this as, or at least what I'm doing with my college, these are semester-long projects. So we look at 3, right? So it's incremental, but we can do good work, right? Because when we find the sweet spot, when we figure out ways to positively impact students by changing the most problematic policies. And then the third kind of level of the impact evaluation grid is just a reflective, right? It's an individualized reflective document where you take a look at the work that you've done, see how you would do things differently, because this is meant to be a kind of living document that y'all can continuously iterate on so that it meets the needs of Green River College. Talked about these. So what we're trying to revisit at our college now is the process for student complaints, right? So students can't complain anonymously. And so at my college, because I'm the director of student equity, on maybe 50% of the syllabi that went out, there was a message that said, if you feel like you're being treated inequitably by your professor or some other person on campus, know that you have an advocate. Please go see the director of equity if you don't feel comfortable talking to that person. So I get to be in dialogue with students about some of these things that are going on. And for the most part, students don't want to complain, even if they feel like they're being treated inequitably, because they don't want to be negatively impacted, right? They want to transfer, they want to do whatever they want to do. They don't want their grade to be impacted. And so what happens is that students end up swallowing this, and more often than not, the students that end up swallowing this are women and students of color, right? What they feel to be mistreatment. And so what we want to do then is create an anonymous complaint procedure, right? But we have to understand at the same time, faculty are people too, right? Administrators are people too, classified folks are people too. So we don't want to launch into a grievance process where students can hurl stones at community folks and they have no recourse. And so the idea is that the anonymous policy, for example, and this has come to fruition because we plugged it into the grid, the anonymous policy wouldn't have the same weight as an official policy, but it would be a way for a dean to have a conversation with someone based on what's going on. It's not going to go on the record. It's not going to be a mark against you. I just want you to know that this is something that has been brought up. Right now, we don't have a process in place. We're trying to figure out what that process would look like, because we talk to students and students say that they're uncomfortable voicing any grievances because they feel like they'll be negatively impacted because of it. And this is what the grid does, right? So we have these policies. Y'all probably have a policy very similar to that, right? In order for a complaint to have any weight, it has to be official complaint and it can't be anonymous. Well, that's a problem. I'm gonna go to the next slide. So this again are the recommendations, right? Form cross-representational inquiry groups, meet bi-monthly, right? This is not to heap anything on anyone else's plate, but heck, what's one more Zoom meeting amongst friends, right? Identify 3 policies to begin with, to use the toolkit, connect with campus equity leaders to enrich and broaden discussions, audit and make recommendations. So for us, what we do is we get this work together and then we go present to our committee, which is called the IPC, the Institutional Planning Committee. So those are the folks who can make policy decisions, right? So you have to also figure out what the procedure is to have conversations about what comes out from the impact grid. Determine with campus leaders what the process will be for changing policies, right? So that's a conversation that folks will need to have. I lead these types of trainings for a couple of colleges. I feel like at some point I'm going to see you all again, so maybe we'll have some conversations about how some of the practices that have come up with regard to applying the impact grid. And so again, I cannot I guess champion this enough. Anybody can do this work. You're working, you don't have to be individual, but in doing the work, that's how you will develop an anti-racist growth mindset. If that is something of interest to you, because in order to do equity work, you have to have an anti-racist growth. It has to be anti-sexist, right? Anti-homophobic, anti-trans, antagonistic, right? But all those things in here around that, right? So in order to be a person who is enamored with justice and working towards justice, you have to adopt a mindset that works to actually identify and deconstruct inequity. Right, and so anti-racist growth mindset is where I feel the best place to start. And again, no matter what you know, at this very moment, you can do this work. I assure you, I've seen it. I have worked with people who, I had a professor who is from Iran. He's in his 60s, and he just felt like women couldn't learn at the same level as men. And so women struggled in his class because of the way that he was teaching them, but that also for him fulfilled the kind of stereotypic understanding that he had about women. So it was this vicious cycle, right? He thought they wouldn't do well, and they did do well because he wasn't treating them well. And so it just kept going. So he went from racism on campus, on hiring committees, everywhere, right? And this work for him was all because he just did the work. He didn't understand it, and he even questioned it, but he committed to doing the work. And in one time, he's completely different, right? And this is a man who's in his 60s, and up until that point had believed that racism wasn't even real. And there are other success stories like that. And so with that, I'm going to end this part of the presentation. I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for your heart for justice. I see in this group a bunch of people who are ready to commit to the work. That's how I see you. I know that you can do it. because quite frankly, you have to. And so there's my information. If we want to get into a conversation later on about how to apply the impact grid, that's great. Let's do that. If you want to do it and you want to have conversations with me about it, shoot me an email and we can talk about it. I'm a resource for you, not just right now, but moving forward. And so thank you again for allowing me to participate in the Gator community. I apologize for all the technical issues. And I just want to thank Rachel for helping. You understand, she was down here doing all kind of stuff, making it work. And the last observation, I just wanted to say, I couldn't wear the sweater that Tanya sent me, but I did. I put on, can you see this? I put on my alligator boots for the Gator fam. Oh, I knocked that thing down too. But it's funny. I can only do that because I'm wearing pants. Because with Zoom, I got this tie on, but nobody knows what's happening after that, right? With Zoom, I could have on shorts. So anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate you all. God bless you all. Thank you for inviting me into your community. I really feel like we're family. And I'm a resource, so reach out if you need me.